The Rhine moved slowly beneath the bridges of Basel in the early summer of 1527, carrying with it the scent of ink and linden blossoms. The city, perched on the river's bend where the Swiss Confederation met the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, had grown into one of Europe's most restless intellectual centers. Printers' workshops lined its narrow streets, their presses turning day and night, feeding a continent hungry for new ideas. Erasmus of Rotterdam had made Basel his home for years, drawn by the brilliance of its publishers, above all Johannes Froben, whose elegant editions of classical and Christian texts circulated from Lisbon to Krakow. Scholars gathered in its taverns and lecture halls. Theologians debated the Reformation in its churches. The university, though modest in size compared to Paris or Bologna, carried itself with the quiet confidence of an institution that believed it understood the order of the natural world. And its physicians, a small, proud faculty, taught medicine exactly as it had been taught for centuries, guided by the unchanging authority of two ancient pillars. The first was Galen of Pergamon, the Greek physician of the 2nd century whose writings on anatomy, physiology, and therapeutics had dominated Western medicine for well over 1,000 years. His system was elegant in its internal logic. The human body, Galen taught, was governed by 4 fundamental fluids, the humors, whose balance determined health and whose imbalance produced disease. Every illness could be understood as a disturbance of this equilibrium. Every treatment aimed to restore it, through purging, through dietary regulation, through the careful adjustment of the patient's regime. The second pillar was Ibn Sina, known to the Latin West as Avicenna, the 11th century Persian polymath whose vast encyclopedic work, the Canon of Medicine, had served as the standard medical textbook in European universities since the 13th century. The Canon synthesized Greek, Arabic, and Persian medical knowledge into a single, systematic whole. It was comprehensive, authoritative, and, in the eyes of the medical establishment, essentially complete. Together, Galen and Avicenna formed the bedrock upon which all respectable medical thought rested. To study medicine in Basel, or in Paris, or in Padua, or in any university of consequence was to study their works. To practice medicine was to apply their principles. To question them was not merely an intellectual risk. It was an act that could end a career before it began. And yet, in that early summer of 1527, someone had come to Basel prepared to do exactly that. His name was Theophrastus Philippus Aureolus Bombastus von Hohenheim. He was not from a great medical dynasty. He held no prestigious chair at a famous university. He had spent the better part of a decade wandering across Europe, through mining towns and military camps, through the workshops of barbers and the huts of folk healers, gathering knowledge in places where no respectable physician would think to look. He dressed not in the academic robes expected of a university lecturer, but in the rough, travel-worn clothing of a man who had lived for years on the road. He was stocky, sharp-eyed, and possessed of a temperament that seemed engineered to make enemies. He would later be known to history as Paracelsus, a name he apparently gave himself, possibly meaning beyond Celsus, the ancient Roman medical writer, or possibly a Latinized play on his family name, Hohenheim. The exact origin of the title remains debated among scholars. What is not debated is the scale of his ambition, or the ferocity with which he pursued it. He had arrived in Basel the previous year under circumstances that seemed, for once, favorable. Johannes Froben, the city's most celebrated printer and a man whose health was a matter of genuine civic concern, had fallen gravely ill. His leg was in a dire state, and the physicians attending him had recommended amputation. Paracelsus was called in, perhaps on Erasmus's suggestion, perhaps through other intermediaries, and managed to improve Froben's condition substantially without resorting to the surgeon's blade. The treatment, whatever it entailed, was successful enough to earn the wandering physician something he had rarely possessed: credibility in the eyes of powerful men. The Basel City Council, impressed by the results, appointed him municipal physician and granted him the right to lecture at the university. For a man who had never held a stable institutional position, who had worn out his welcome in more towns than he could count, this was a remarkable opening. A chance not only to practice, but to teach, to prove that his entire understanding of medicine was superior to the tradition that had governed European healing for more than a millennium. He wasted no time making his intentions unmistakable. From his very first lecture, he shattered convention. He spoke not in Latin, the sacred language of academic medicine, the tongue in which every serious physician published, debated, and instructed, but in German, the vernacular, the language of merchants, soldiers, and the common people. For the members of the medical faculty, this was not a stylistic choice. It was an affront. Latin was not merely a means of communication. It was a wall, a mark of distinction that separated the educated physician from the barber, the herbalist, the village healer. By lecturing in German, Paracelsus was not simply making his ideas accessible to a broader audience. He was dismantling a hierarchy that the profession had spent centuries constructing. And his ideas were no less confrontational than his choice of language. He announced to his students, and to anyone else who cared to listen, that the medicine they had inherited was hollow at its core. He declared that Galen's teachings had led physicians astray for over 1,000 years. He insisted that Avicenna's canon, for all its monumental erudition, was little more than an elaborate architecture of error. He claimed to have learned more from the untutored experience of midwives and miners than the entire medical faculty of any European university could teach in a lifetime. He called his fellow professors imitators, men who repeated ancient mistakes with the solemnity of priests performing a ritual whose meaning they had long since forgotten. The faculty, predictably, was incensed. Some regarded him as a dangerous provocateur. Others dismissed him as a crude showman unworthy of serious attention. But Paracelsus had the backing of the city council, and for the moment, their outrage could not touch him. Then came the fire. The exact circumstances remain a matter of historical contention. Some accounts place the event on the night of the feast of St. John, the 24th of June, 1527, when bonfires were traditionally lit throughout European cities to mark the summer solstice. In this telling, Paracelsus simply added his own contribution to the communal flames. Other sources suggest it occurred inside or near a lecture hall, perhaps in a brazier, as a dramatic punctuation to one of his lectures. Still, other historians have argued that the entire episode was exaggerated, embellished, or even fabricated by later admirers and opponents alike, each side eager to shape the legend for its own purposes. The documentary evidence is thin. But what the weight of tradition has preserved, and what Paracelsus's own followers proudly repeated in the decades after his passing, is a scene of extraordinary symbolic force. A physician taking a copy of Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, the single most revered textbook in the Western medical world, and consigning it to the flames. Whether the fire was literal in every detail or partly the product of later myth-making, its meaning was unmistakable. This was not a scholar offering a cautious revision of received wisdom. This was not a reformer suggesting modest adjustments within an existing framework. This was an act of intellectual rupture, a public declaration that the old medicine was not merely incomplete but fundamentally broken, that it could not be repaired, and that something entirely new needed to rise from its place. In a world where books were expensive and scarce, where knowledge was transmitted through generations of painstaking commentary upon ancient authorities, where the very architecture of medical education depended on unbroken continuity with the past, the burning of the canon was a provocation beyond measure. It carried echoes of another recent act of defiance, Martin Luther, standing before the church and insisting that its foundations were unsound. Like Luther's challenge, the bonfire at Basel was both a liberation and a fracture, a door thrown open and a bridge burned behind. The city watched, the faculty seethed, and the man at the center of it all, stocky, unwashed by some accounts, radiating a self-assurance that his critics found indistinguishable from arrogance, showed no sign of retreat. He seemed to believe with absolute conviction that he was right and that the centuries arrayed against him were wrong. But who was he truly? Not the legend, not the caricature, the actual man. Where had this strange, combative, impossibly self-certain figure come from? What had he witnessed in his years of wandering, and what had shaped him so profoundly that he could arrive at the conviction that 1,000 years of accumulated medical authority deserved to be reduced to ash? To find those answers, the story must travel backward, more than 3 decades, to a small pilgrimage town nestled in the Swiss mountains, where a boy grew up beside an abbey, learned the names of herbs and minerals from a father who practiced medicine far from any seat of power, and first descended into the dark, ore-laden tunnels that would transform his understanding of the human body and the nature of disease itself. The town of Einsiedeln sat high in the foothills of the Swiss Alps, encircled by dark forests and watched over by a Benedictine abbey that had drawn pilgrims for centuries. It was a place defined by devotion and solitude, remote, quiet, suspended between earth and heaven. The abbey's Black Madonna was famous across the German-speaking world, and travelers arrived in every season to kneel before her, to seek intercession, to leave behind their burdens and begin the long walk home. Einsiedeln was accustomed to transients, to people passing through. It was not, by any measure, a center of learning, commerce, or medical innovation. And yet it was here, in approximately 1493 or 1494, the precise year remains uncertain, that the child who would one day set fire to European medicine's most sacred text entered the world. His father, Wilhelm Bombest von Hohenheim, was a physician, not a celebrated one, not a man who held a university chair or commanded the attention of princes. He was a practitioner of modest means and minor noble lineage, educated enough to read the medical authorities of his time, but far too removed from the great centers of power to build the kind of career that would leave a mark in official records. What little is known of him suggests a figure of quiet competence, a man who treated the sick in a rural community, who understood plants and their properties, and who took his responsibilities as a father and teacher with genuine seriousness. Of the boy's mother, history has preserved almost nothing. She is believed to have been connected to the abbey in some capacity, perhaps as a bondswoman or attendant, and she appears to have vanished from the family's life when Theophrastus was still very young. Whether she perished, departed, or was simply erased from the record by the indifference of chroniclers who saw no reason to document the life of an obscure woman in a mountain town, no one can say with certainty. What is clear is that the boy grew up primarily in his father's care, and that this relationship, between a provincial physician and his only son, would prove to be one of the most consequential in the history of Western medicine. Wilhelm taught the boy what he knew. He introduced him to the names and uses of herbs, to the principles of Galenic medicine as he understood them, to the basics of diagnosis and treatment as practiced in the late 15th century. But he also taught him something less tangible and perhaps more important, a respect for the material world, for substances and their behaviors, for the way minerals formed in rock and metals responded to heat. This was not the education of a university. It was the education of a man who lived close to the earth and paid attention to what the earth revealed. And when the family relocated, sometime around 1502, to the town of Villach in the Duchy of Carinthia, deep in the Alpine mining country of what is now southern Austria, the scope of that education expanded dramatically. Villach was a different world from Einsiedeln. It sat at the crossroads of trade routes linking the Adriatic coast to the German lands, and its economy was intertwined with the vast mining operations that honeycombed the mountains of Tyrol, Carinthia, and the surrounding regions. Silver, copper, lead, and mercury were extracted from these mountains in enormous quantities. The Fugger banking dynasty of Augsburg, the wealthiest family in Europe, had invested heavily in these operations, and the mines they controlled were among the most productive and most punishing enterprises on the continent. Thousands of men labored underground, descending into shafts that reached deep beneath the Alpine meadows, breathing air thick with mineral dust, handling ores that released invisible fumes when heated. It was grueling, dangerous work, and the men who performed it bore the marks of their labor in ways that no physician trained exclusively in humoral theory could easily explain. Young Theophrastus, still a boy, accompanied his father into this landscape. Wilhelm von Hohenheim had taken a position that brought him into contact with the mining community, possibly teaching at the mining school in Villach or serving as a physician to the workers and their families. The boy watched. He observed the miners who emerged from the tunnels coughing, wheezing, their joints swollen, their skin discolored by prolonged contact with metallic compounds. He saw men who had labored for years in the smelting works struggle to draw breath, their lungs slowly failing them in ways that the classical medical texts never described and could not adequately account for. These were not ailments caused by an imbalance of the four humors. These were not conditions that could be remedied by adjusting diet or purging excess fluids. Something else was happening, something that had to do with the substances themselves, with what the miners inhaled and touched and absorbed into their bodies day after day, year after year. It would be decades before Paracelsus committed these observations to writing, but the seed was planted here, in the shadows of the Carinthian mountains, in the space between his father's modest medical learning and the undeniable evidence of suffering that no existing theory could explain. The conviction that would define his life's work, that disease is caused not by abstract imbalances, but by specific material agents acting upon the body, began not in a lecture hall or a library, but in the tunnels and smelting houses of the Eastern Alps. As the boy grew into a young man, his education took a more formal turn. The details, once again, are frustratingly incomplete. He appears to have studied at the University of Vienna, possibly around 1509 or 1510, where he would have encountered the standard scholastic curriculum, logic, natural philosophy, and the foundational texts of Galenic medicine delivered through layers of Latin commentary. Vienna was not a radical institution. Its medical teaching followed the patterns established across Europe. The professor read aloud from Galen or Avicenna, offered interpretive commentary drawn from earlier commentators, and the students absorbed, memorized, and repeated. Original observation was not encouraged. Clinical experience at the bedside played almost no role. The young Theophrastus, already shaped by years of direct contact with the material realities of disease, must have found this method profoundly unsatisfying. There is no record of distinction, no evidence of academic honors, nothing to suggest that the university recognized in him anything out of the ordinary. From Vienna, the trail leads tentatively, provisionally, to Italy. Some scholars believe he traveled south to the University of Ferrara, where he may have obtained a doctoral degree in medicine around 1515 or 1516. Ferrara was a more cosmopolitan environment than Vienna, and its intellectual atmosphere was richer. Renaissance humanism was reshaping Italian culture, and the universities of the peninsula were beginning to feel, however faintly, the first tremors of a challenge to scholastic authority. New translations of ancient Greek texts were circulating. Anatomists were beginning to question whether Galen's descriptions of the body, based largely on animal dissection, truly matched what could be observed in human cadavers. The Hermetic tradition, a body of mystical and philosophical writings attributed to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus, was enjoying a dramatic revival, championed by thinkers like Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who saw in these texts a secret, ancient wisdom that could reconcile philosophy, theology, and natural knowledge into a unified whole. Whether Paracelsus encountered these currents directly during his time in Italy, or absorbed them later through reading and conversation, their influence on his thinking would prove deep and lasting. The Hermetic tradition offered him something that scholastic medicine did not: a vision of the universe as a living, interconnected whole, in which the movements of the stars mirrored the processes of the body, in which minerals and plants carried hidden signatures revealing their medicinal purposes, and in which the physician was not merely a technician applying rules from a textbook, but an interpreter of nature's deepest secrets. This vision was intoxicating, and it was dangerous because it blurred the boundary between observation and revelation, between chemistry and mysticism, between what could be tested and what could only be believed. It was a tension that Paracelsus would carry with him for the rest of his life, and one that he would never fully resolve. But what mattered most, in the years immediately following his education, was not what he had learned in any university. It was what he had failed to find there. He had come seeking a coherent understanding of disease, a framework that matched the suffering he had witnessed in the mining towns of Carinthia, a system that could account for the specific material, chemical nature of illness. What he had been given instead was commentary upon commentary, authority layered upon authority, a tradition that answered every question by pointing backward to Galen and Avicenna rather than forward to the bedside, the laboratory, or the mine. The universities had offered him a closed system, elegant and internally consistent, but increasingly disconnected from the reality of the bodies it claimed to understand. He did not settle. He did not open a practice, take a wife, accept a position at some provincial court, and spend his remaining years applying the doctrines he had been taught. Instead, he made a choice that was rare even in an age of considerable intellectual restlessness, a choice that would consume the next decade of his life and transform him from an obscure, discontented young physician into the most polarizing medical thinker of his century. He walked away from the institutions entirely. He turned his back on the lecture hall, the library, the established pathways of professional advancement, and he set out, on foot and with little money, into the vast, turbulent, and endlessly varied landscape of early 16th century Europe, seeking knowledge in the only places he trusted, among the people who worked with their hands, who lived close to the substances of the earth, and who healed the sick not by quoting ancient Greeks but by observing, experimenting, and sometimes failing. The road would be long. It would take him across borders, through wars, into courts and hovels alike, and it would forge the mind that, years later, would stand before a bonfire in Basel and declare that a new medicine must rise from the ruin of the old. He walked into a continent that was tearing itself apart. The Europe that Paracelsus entered as a young itinerant physician sometime around 1517 was a place of extraordinary upheaval, political, religious, intellectual, and military. The Italian wars were still grinding on, reshaping borders and scattering populations. In the German lands, Martin Luther had just launched his challenge to the Church's authority, setting in motion a religious rupture that would consume generations. The Ottoman Empire was pressing westward through the Balkans. Printing presses were accelerating the movement of ideas to a speed that no institution could fully control. It was a world in which old certainties were collapsing and new ones had not yet formed. A world perfectly suited to a man who trusted nothing he had not seen for himself. The precise itinerary of Paracelsus's wandering years has never been established with full confidence, and it likely never will be. He left behind no systematic travel diary, no dated letters marking his passage through particular cities. What survives are scattered references in his own later writings, often vague, sometimes contradictory, occasionally grandiose, and the testimony of contemporaries who encountered him briefly and remembered him with varying degrees of accuracy. From these fragments, scholars have reconstructed a journey stretching across perhaps a decade and covering vast stretches of the European continent. He appears to have moved through the German-speaking lands extensively, Strasbourg, Nuremberg, the towns of Bavaria and Saxony. He likely spent time in the Low Countries and in France. He may have traveled as far north as Scandinavia and as far east as the borderlands of Poland and Lithuania. Some accounts place him in England and Ireland. Others claim he ventured deep into Ottoman territory, reaching Constantinople, though these claims, often originating from Paracelsus himself or from his later followers, should be treated with the caution they deserve. He was not above mythologizing his own experience. He understood, perhaps instinctively, that the image of a physician who had traveled to the edges of the known world carried a persuasive power that no university diploma could match. What is beyond reasonable doubt is that he moved constantly, stayed nowhere for long, and sought out forms of knowledge that the medical establishment considered beneath serious attention. He visited mining communities wherever he found them, in the Tyrol, in Saxony, in the Ore Mountains of Bohemia. He sought out herbalists and folk healers, men and women who possessed generations of accumulated practical knowledge about the medicinal properties of plants, roots, and mineral preparations. He consulted with barber surgeons, the rough, capable practitioners who handled wounds and battlefield injuries, while university-trained physicians confined themselves to learned diagnosis. He listened to midwives, to rural apothecaries, to alchemists working in smoky cellars, to anyone whose knowledge came from direct engagement with the material world rather than from ancient texts. This was not merely an unconventional approach to education. It was a deliberate philosophical stance, a rejection of the idea that medical truth flowed downward from authoritative texts, and an insistence that it could be found in the lived experience of ordinary people who worked with substances, bodies, and disease on a daily basis. Paracelsus was assembling a counter-tradition, a body of knowledge built not from libraries but from the field. Somewhere during these years, he also served as a military surgeon. The early 16th century offered no shortage of opportunities for a physician willing to follow armies. Paracelsus appears to have attached himself to military campaigns on more than one occasion, possibly serving in the forces of Venice, possibly accompanying the armies of Christian II of Denmark. The documentary evidence is sparse, but the experience would have been formative. A military surgeon in the early 1500s operated in conditions of terrible urgency and almost complete theoretical inadequacy. The Galenic framework offered little practical guidance for battlefield injuries. The men who actually treated the wounded, barber surgeons, camp followers, improvising practitioners, worked largely outside the academic system. By placing himself among them, Paracelsus was positioning himself at the exact point where the gap between traditional medical theory and practical reality was widest. Every wound that responded to treatments not described in Galen, every recovery that defied humoral predictions, reinforced his conviction that the ancient authorities were not merely incomplete, but actively misleading. And through it all, the loneliness. For nearly a decade, he had no fixed home. He belonged to no institution, held no appointment, answered to no patron. He never married. There is no record of children, no mention of lasting companionship. His relationships followed a depressingly consistent pattern: initial welcome, productive exchange, and then, inevitably, a falling out, driven by his abrasiveness and his seemingly inexhaustible capacity for antagonizing the people around him. Town after town, court after court, he arrived with promise and departed in acrimony. Later detractors would paint him as a drunkard and a braggart. Later admirers would reimagine him as a solitary genius misunderstood by lesser minds. The truth resists such neat categories. Paracelsus was brilliant, observant, and capable of genuine originality. He was also vain, combative, and possessed of a self-regard so immense that it frequently eclipsed his ability to communicate his ideas effectively. The name itself tells the story. He called himself Paracelsus, whether it meant beyond Celsus, surpassing the great Roman medical writer, or derived from some other root, and the choice reveals something essential about the way he saw himself. He was not seeking a place within the existing order. He was announcing his intention to transcend it. The Europe through which he moved provided a constant backdrop of disruption, mirroring his own restlessness. The Reformation was fracturing religious unity. The printing revolution was democratizing knowledge, placing texts once confined to monastic libraries into the hands of merchants and artisans. The old hierarchies of church, university, and guild were under pressure from forces they could not contain. Paracelsus's insistence that medical knowledge could be found outside the academy, that the testimony of a minor might carry more truth than the commentary of a professor, was a profoundly egalitarian claim, even if the man making it was hardly a model of egalitarian temperament. By the mid-1520s, after years of ceaseless movement, he had accumulated an extraordinary body of knowledge. He had seen diseases no university curriculum addressed. He had observed treatments no textbook described. He had formed convictions about the chemical nature of illness that contradicted everything the medical establishment held sacred. And he had developed a personal philosophy, part empirical, part mystical, part prophetic, that he believed represented the foundation of an entirely new medicine. What he lacked was a platform, a stage large enough to make his challenge visible beyond the taverns and sick rooms, where he had spent a decade arguing with anyone who would listen. And then, in 1526, word reached him of a celebrated printer in Basel who had fallen gravely ill and whose physicians had failed him. The opportunity was almost too perfect. A wealthy, influential patient in a city known for its intellectual ferment, a city with a university whose medical faculty he could confront directly. He made his way to the Rhine, crossed its bridge, and entered the gates of a place that would grant him, for one brief and incandescent year, exactly what he had been searching for. The man who walked into Basel was not a diplomat. He was a wanderer who had spent 10 years refining his fury into philosophy, and his philosophy into a weapon. The only question was how long the city would tolerate the force of his conviction before it expelled him, as every other place had done before. The house of Johannes Froben stood near the heart of Basel, and in the autumn of 1526 it had become a place of anxious waiting. Froben was not merely a printer. He was one of the most important cultural figures in Northern Europe. His publishing house had produced landmark editions of the Church Fathers, classical texts, and the writings of Erasmus, whose influence on European thought depended in no small part on Froben's beautifully produced, widely distributed books. The two men were close personal friends, and Erasmus had made Basel his home in large measure because Froben was there. When Froben fell seriously ill, suffering from a condition in his leg that caused severe pain and growing debility, the consequences extended beyond one household. If Basel lost Froben, it lost a pillar of its intellectual identity. The physicians attending him recommended amputation. In the medical logic of the early 16th century, this was not unusual. When a limb appeared beyond recovery, removal was considered reasonable, however grim the procedure. But Froben resisted, and those close to him began to seek alternatives. It was through this network of concern that Paracelsus came to Basel's attention. He was summoned, examined the patient, and undertook a treatment that produced remarkable improvement. Froben regained the use of his leg. The wandering physician who had spent a decade on the margins had demonstrated that his approach could succeed where conventional practice had reached its limit. The details of the treatment have not survived. What is known is that the result earned Paracelsus something far more valuable than a fee: the trust of powerful men. Erasmus himself appears to have consulted him, finding his medical skill impressive but his personality difficult. More importantly, Froben's recovery opened a door that had been closed throughout Paracelsus's career, the door to official appointment. In early 1527, the Basel City Council named him municipal physician and granted him the privilege of lecturing at the university. The appointment was unusual in every respect. Paracelsus lacked verifiable credentials the faculty found satisfactory. His manner was abrasive. His ideas appeared to contradict accepted teaching. The appointment was driven by the council's gratitude and by political dynamics in which civic authority and academic authority did not always align. The professors were forced to accept a colleague they had not chosen, did not want, and could not control. It became clear immediately that Paracelsus had no intention of fitting into the existing order. Medical instruction at a 16th century university was rigid and ritualized. The professor read aloud from canonical texts, Galen, Avicenna, Hippocrates, while students listened, copied, and memorized. The professor's role was not to generate new knowledge but to transmit old knowledge, serving as a conduit between ancient authorities and the next generation. Innovation was neither expected nor desired. The system's strength lay in its continuity, its claim to represent unbroken wisdom stretching back to the Greeks. Paracelsus shattered every element of this structure. He refused to lecture from canonical texts, announcing that his teaching would be drawn from his own clinical experience. He spoke in German, a decision whose significance extended far beyond convenience. Latin was the marker distinguishing the university-trained physician from the barber and the herbalist. To lecture in the vernacular was to suggest that medical knowledge was not the exclusive property of the Latinate elite, but something accessible to a broader audience. For the faculty, this was not democratization, it was desecration. But the content of his teaching proved more threatening still. Paracelsus did not merely supplement tradition, he attacked it directly. He declared that the prevailing understanding of disease, rooted in the four humors, was fundamentally wrong. He asserted that illness arose from specific external agents, chemical in nature, that disrupted the body's processes. He proposed that treatment should consist of targeted chemical remedies rather than generic purging. And he insisted that the only reliable source of medical knowledge was direct observation, not the authority of texts written centuries ago. His conflict extended beyond the university. The apothecaries of Basel, the guild holding a monopoly on medicine preparation, viewed Paracelsus with intense hostility. He compounded his own chemical and mineral preparations rather than purchasing from their shops, threatening both their professional authority and their income. The guild fought back, lodging complaints and working to undermine his position. For a few months the situation held, but the structure was fragile. He had no allies within the faculty. His standing depended on continued goodwill from the city council, and then the pillar supporting him gave way. Johannes Froben, the man whose recovery had made everything possible, succumbed to a sudden seizure, likely a stroke, in October of 1527. With him went the most powerful argument for Paracelsus's competence. His enemies were quick to note the irony. The patient whose cure had justified this radical outsider's appointment had not, in the end, been saved. The political ground began to shift. It was at this precarious moment that Paracelsus made the mistake that would cost him everything. A wealthy canon of Basel's cathedral, Cornelius von Lichtenfels, had fallen ill and sought his help. They agreed on a substantial fee contingent on a successful cure. Paracelsus treated him and the canon recovered, but Lichtenfels refused to honor the agreement, offering only a fraction of the promised amount. Paracelsus took the matter to court. The court ruled against him. And here, where a more cautious man might have retreated, Paracelsus did what he always did. He erupted, attacking the magistrates in terms so intemperate they could not be ignored. He denounced the court, the legal system, and the medical establishment he believed had conspired against him. By early 1528, barely a year after his triumphant arrival, he was forced to flee Basel under cover of night, leaving behind possessions, manuscripts, and whatever remained of his institutional credibility. The city that had offered him the greatest opportunity of his life had become, like every place before it, a site of exile. The pattern was now unmistakable. Paracelsus possessed ideas of genuine originality, ideas that would reshape medical thought in the centuries to come. But he could not build the institutional structures necessary to sustain them. He could not maintain alliances, navigate political complexities, or restrain his temperament long enough to consolidate a position. His brilliance and his self-destructiveness were not separate qualities. They were expressions of the same fundamental refusal to compromise, to accommodate, to accept any authority other than his own experience and judgment. This made him a visionary. It also made him, in practical terms, impossible. He had lost his position, his city, and his reputation, but the ideas he had proclaimed from that lectern could not be confiscated. The conviction that disease was a chemical process, that remedies must target specific causes, that the dose determines whether a substance heals or harms, these had been spoken aloud, in the vernacular, before audiences that carried what they heard beyond Basel's walls. The question those ideas posed, whether a millennium of inherited medical wisdom could truly be wrong, would now have to be answered not by Paracelsus alone, but by the century that followed him. To understand what Paracelsus was proposing, it is necessary to understand what he was proposing to destroy. For more than 1,000 years, Western medicine had rested on a single, comprehensive, internally elegant theory of the human body. Its origins lay in ancient Greece, in the writings attributed to Hippocrates and systematized by Galen of Pergamon in the 2nd century. At its center stood the doctrine of the four humors, four fundamental fluids whose balance governed every aspect of human health. The sanguine humor, associated with warmth and moisture. The choleric, linked to warmth and dryness. The melancholic, cold and dry. The phlegmatic, cold and moist. Each corresponded to an element, a season, a temperament. Health existed when the four flowed in proper proportion. Disease arose when that proportion was disturbed. The beauty of this system lay in its universality. It could explain virtually anything. A fever was an excess of choler. Thick secretions suggested overabundant phlegm. A sluggish, despondent patient suffered from melancholic excess. The physician's task was to identify which humor was out of balance and apply the appropriate counterbalancing remedy, adjusting diet, purging excess, or opening a vein to release surplus fluid. The system was logical, teachable, and reassuring. It gave both physician and patient a shared language for understanding suffering. It was also, in Paracelsus's view, almost entirely wrong. Not wrong in a minor, correctable way, wrong at its foundation, wrong in its basic assumption about what disease was, how it operated, and what a physician needed to do. The alternative he offered amounted not to reform, but to complete reconstruction from the ground upward. At the heart of his system stood three principles, not four humors but three substances he believed constituted the essence of all matter, including the human body. He called them sulfur, mercury, and salt. These did not refer to literal chemical substances as a modern chemist would understand them. They were philosophical categories describing essential properties. Sulfur represented combustibility, everything that could burn, transform, carry the energy of change. Mercury represented volatility, everything that could flow, evaporate, shift between states. Salt represented solidity, the mineral residue, the stable foundation giving matter its permanence. Every substance in the natural world, Paracelsus argued, was a combination of these three in varying proportions. Wood burned because it contained sulfur. Water flowed because mercury dominated. Stone endured because its salt was predominant. And the human body was a dynamic interplay of all three, a living chemical process in which sulfur, mercury, and salt were constantly transformed, separated, and recombined. This framework, known to later scholars as the tria prima, was not entirely without precedent. Alchemical tradition had long recognized sulfur and mercury as principles of metallic transformation. Paracelsus's innovation was adding salt as a third principle, extending the framework from metallurgy to medicine, and insisting that it replaced rather than supplemented the humoral system. Where Galen saw four fluids in equilibrium, Paracelsus saw three chemical principles in continuous transformation. Where the Galenist asked which humor was imbalanced, Paracelsus asked which chemical process had been disrupted, and by what agent. This last point marked the sharpest break with tradition. In humoral medicine, disease was a general condition, a systemic imbalance affecting the entire constitution. Treatment was correspondingly general: adjust diet, purge excess, restore equilibrium. Paracelsus rejected this with something close to contempt. He argued that each disease was a distinct entity with a specific cause, an external agent, chemical or mineral in nature, that disrupted a particular process. The physician's task was to identify that cause and apply the specific remedy capable of counteracting it. A disease of the lungs caused by inhaled mineral dust required entirely different treatment from a disease of the stomach caused by corrupted food. To treat both with the same regimen of purging was not medicine, but negligence dressed in the robes of tradition. From this insistence on specificity flowed one of the most consequential ideas in medical history, an idea so simple that its revolutionary character is easy to underestimate. Paracelsus articulated it in a passage that has become the most quoted sentence in the history of toxicology. All things carry the potential for harm, and nothing exists entirely without it. Only the dose determines whether a substance proves harmful or harmless. The implications were enormous. If every substance was potentially both remedy and poison, then the boundary between medicine and toxicology was not one of kind but of quantity. The same mercury that ravaged the body in large amounts might, in carefully controlled doses, act therapeutically. The same mineral that caused suffering when inhaled as dust might, when purified and administered precisely, serve as a cure. The physician was not merely a restorer of balance, but a chemist, someone who understood substances, their interactions with the body, and the conditions under which a harmful agent could become a healing one. Paracelsus also introduced a concept he called the archeus, an internal governing force, a kind of vital alchemist within the body, responsible for transforming and distributing ingested substances. When a person consumed food, the archeus separated nourishment from waste, directing each to its proper destination. When the archeus functioned well, health was maintained. When overwhelmed or disrupted by poison, by substances the body could not process, disease resulted. The concept was speculative, steeped in alchemical language, and bore no resemblance to any mechanism modern biochemistry would recognize. Yet in its underlying logic, it represented something new, an attempt to think about the body as a site of continuous chemical transformation, where health and disease were products of material processes rather than fluid balances. The archeus was not metabolism as the modern world understands it, but it was an early attempt to imagine what metabolism might be. The audacity of these claims deserves emphasis. Paracelsus was a man without a permanent position, without institutional backing, without a single major published work at the time of the Basel lectures. And he was asserting that the theoretical framework governing European medicine for over a millennium, endorsed by every university, taught by every professor, embedded in every physician's training, was not merely flawed but false. The arrogance was breathtaking, but so was the insight. Because embedded within his mystical language, his alchemical metaphors, and his frequently chaotic exposition were ideas the future would vindicate, not in their specific details, but in their orientation. The notion that diseases have specific causes, the principle that dose determines effect, the conviction that the body is a system of chemical processes, the insistence that treatment should target causes rather than merely address symptoms. These ideas, stripped of their 16th century philosophical clothing, would become foundational to pharmacology, toxicology, and modern biomedicine. Paracelsus arrived at them not through controlled experimentation, but through observation, alchemical reasoning, and intellectual force. An unruly process that produced lasting insights alongside claims later centuries would rightly discard. He had declared that disease was chemistry, that the body was a furnace, that the physician must become an alchemist of the living. But philosophy alone changes nothing. Whether these ideas could be translated into practice, whether his chemical medicines could accomplish what the old remedies could not, that was the question on which everything depended. The disease arrived in Europe like a slow-moving storm. In the final years of the 15th century, a new and terrifying affliction began spreading across the continent through port cities, military camps, and trading routes. It was called by many names, each nation blaming its neighbor: the French disease, the Neapolitan sickness, the Great Pox. Later centuries would know it as syphilis. Its early stages produced sores and rashes. Its later stages brought progressive, merciless deterioration that could consume years, leaving its victims disfigured and increasingly isolated by a society that regarded the affliction as both a medical catastrophe and a mark of moral failure. The physicians of Europe were helpless. The humoral framework offered no coherent explanation for a disease that followed its own internal logic regardless of the patient's constitution or temperament. Galenic remedies proved entirely ineffective. Into this vacuum stepped a treatment that was less medical than commercial: guaiac wood, a dense tropical timber imported from the Caribbean at enormous expense. The Fugger banking dynasty of Augsburg held a near monopoly on the guaiac trade and stood to profit enormously from its acceptance as a standard remedy. Medical treatises endorsing the wood appeared with suspicious regularity, often written by physicians whose connections to Fugger interests were poorly concealed. Paracelsus saw through this arrangement with a clarity sharpened by years of observing the intersection of commerce and medicine. He attacked the guaiac trade directly, arguing that the wood was worthless, a fraud perpetuated by merchants masquerading as healers. The treatise was characteristic, insightful in its analysis, reckless in its language, and devastating to his own prospects, since the Fuggers were powerful enough to suppress it. But his critique was not merely destructive. He offered an alternative. Mercury, the volatile metal alchemists had studied for centuries, could be prepared and administered in forms that acted directly against the disease. Mercury had been applied to syphilitic sores before Paracelsus, but he brought something that had been lacking: a theoretical justification rooted in chemical philosophy. If syphilis was caused by a specific agent disrupting specific processes, then the remedy must target that agent. Mercury, properly prepared and carefully dosed, could serve that purpose. The emphasis on dosage was critical. Paracelsus understood from clinical observation that mercury in excessive quantities was itself devastating, producing tremors, loosening of teeth, and a cascade of symptoms as ruinous as the disease being treated. The physician's art lay in navigating the narrow passage between therapeutic effect and toxic harm. His mercury treatments were crude by later standards and carried significant risks, but they represented something of genuine importance: an early, deliberate attempt to use a specific chemical agent against a specific disease, guided by awareness of both potential benefit and potential danger. The treatment of syphilis was not merely a clinical episode. It was a demonstration of Paracelsus's chemical philosophy in action. Disease was chemistry. Remedy was chemistry. And the distance between healing and harming was measured in grains and drops. If syphilis demonstrated his approach to treatment, it was the suffering of minors that demonstrated his approach to understanding the origins of disease. He had carried childhood observations from the mountains of Carinthia through every year of his wandering, and by the early 1530s, he finally committed them to paper. The resulting work, Von der Bergsucht und anderen Bergkrankheit, on the miner's sickness and other miners' diseases, was composed around 1533, though it would not be published until after his passing. It stands as one of the earliest systematic studies of occupational illness in European medical literature. Paracelsus documented the respiratory afflictions plaguing men who spent their lives underground. He described persistent coughs, progressive shortness of breath, the wasting that overtook miners after years of exposure to metallic dusts and furnace fumes. He noted that different mines produced different patterns of illness. Men working with mercury ores suffered differently from those working with lead, and smelter workers exhibited symptoms distinct from those extracting raw ore. This attention to specificity reflected his core principle: The cause determines the disease's nature, and the nature determines its remedy. The intellectual leap embedded in this work is easy to underestimate. In the early 16th century, the humoral framework had no mechanism for explaining how external substances could produce specific internal diseases. If a miner fell ill, the Galenic physician would examine his constitution, diet, and temperament. The idea that the mine itself was the cause, that the air a miner breathed was altering the chemistry of his body, was foreign to everything the tradition taught. Paracelsus saw the connection as obvious. His chemical philosophy gave him language for what he had observed. Substances entering the body from outside could disrupt its internal chemistry and produce disease. The environment was not merely a backdrop to illness. It was, in many cases, its direct cause. This insight would not be fully developed for centuries. Occupational medicine would not emerge as a recognized discipline until the work of Bernardino Ramazzini at the turn of the 18th century, more than 150 years later. But the seed was planted here, in the observations of a physician who had spent his childhood watching miners descend into tunnels and emerge struggling to breathe. Beyond mercury and mining diseases, Paracelsus contributed to a broader transformation of the pharmacopoeia. Traditional Galenic pharmacy relied overwhelmingly on plant-based preparations. Mineral and metallic remedies were regarded with deep suspicion. Paracelsus challenged this boundary directly. He championed mineral waters whose therapeutic reputation had existed since antiquity, but whose mechanism the humoral tradition could never explain. He experimented with preparations of iron, antimony, and metallic salts, and he developed a formulation he called laudanum, a term whose exact meaning and his usage has been debated for centuries. Later generations associated the name with tincture of opium, but Paracelsus's preparation may have been different, possibly incorporating opium alongside other ingredients in varying compositions. What is clear is that he recognized opium's extraordinary power to alleviate suffering and sought to harness it within a framework of careful dosage. These contributions, mercury treatments, documentation of miners' diseases, mineral remedies, laudanum, constituted a practical revolution paralleling the theoretical one. Paracelsus was not merely arguing that medicine should be chemical. He was demonstrating it, substance by substance, disease by disease. His methods were often rough, his preparations sometimes dangerous. But the direction was unmistakable, away from generic humoral therapeutics and toward a medicine in which specific agents were matched to specific conditions, in which the physician's knowledge of minerals and their transformations was as essential as his knowledge of herbs. And yet, for all his insistence on observation, Paracelsus never fully extracted himself from a far older tradition. His chemistry was inseparable from alchemy. His medicine was entangled with mysticism at every level. He could describe miners' respiratory ailments with empirical precision, and in the next passage, invoke the influence of celestial bodies with the conviction of a mystic. This tension between the furnace and the stars, between laboratory and heavens, was not a flaw that could be removed from his system. It was woven into the fabric of his thought, and it is this tension that makes his legacy so difficult to resolve. There is a temptation, when telling the story of Paracelsus, to divide him neatly in two, to separate the empiricist from the mystic, the chemist from the magician, the pioneering observer of disease from the man who believed the stars governed the body and that God had inscribed secret messages on the surfaces of plants. Later centuries, eager to claim him as a forerunner of modern science, have often attempted precisely this division, extracting the ideas that proved fruitful and discarding the rest as residue of a superstitious age. But this separation is a distortion. Paracelsus did not experience his own thought as divided. His chemistry and his mysticism were one endeavor, a unified attempt to read the book of nature in its entirety, from the composition of minerals to the movements of planets. To understand this, it is necessary to enter the intellectual world of the early 16th century without later assumptions. The boundaries the modern era draws between science and magic, chemistry and alchemy, astronomy and astrology did not exist in Paracelsus's time, or existed only in faint, shifting forms. The same thinkers who advanced mathematics also cast horoscopes. The same minds investigating metals also sought the philosopher's stone. The great intellectual project of the Renaissance was synthesis, the dream of unified knowledge encompassing the natural, the divine, and the human. And the tradition promising this synthesis most powerfully was the Hermetic tradition. Hermetic writings, attributed to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus, supposedly an ancient Egyptian sage, had been translated into Latin by Marsilio Ficino in the 1460s at the court of Cosimo de' Medici. Their impact on Renaissance thought was enormous. The texts presented the universe as a living, interconnected whole, a cosmos in which every part mirrored every other, in which celestial movements resonated through the mineral kingdom, the plant kingdom, and the human body. The central Hermetic principle was correspondence between macrocosm and microcosm. The universe was the large world, the human being the small world, and their structures reflected each other. Planets were not distant objects but active forces shaping the growth of metals, the flowering of plants, and the health of the human frame. Paracelsus absorbed this tradition deeply. He believed a physician who did not understand the stars was incomplete, not because astrology predicted the future, but because celestial influences were part of the causal fabric of disease. The physician was not merely a chemist but an interpreter of the cosmos, standing at the intersection of heaven and earth. This connected to another doctrine Paracelsus embraced with particular enthusiasm, the doctrine of signatures. Its premise was intuitive. God, having created both diseases and their remedies, had inscribed visible signs on natural things indicating their medicinal uses. A plant whose leaves resembled a liver was intended for liver ailments. A root branching like human limbs suited conditions of the extremities. Nature was a book, and the physician who learned to read its signs could discover remedies no textual scholarship would reveal. The doctrine was not original to Paracelsus, but he gave it new prominence and integrated it into his chemical philosophy in ways that amplified its later influence. For him, signatures were not metaphors, but evidence of divine design, proof that the Creator had embedded therapeutic knowledge directly into creation. Here, the tension at the heart of his thought becomes most visible. His insistence that disease had specific chemical causes, that remedies must be targeted, that the dose determined the difference between cure and harm. These were principles grounded in material observation. His conviction that celestial influences shaped disease, that plant surfaces carried divinely encoded messages, that the physician needed spiritual illumination. These were claims rooted in faith, in a cosmological vision that could not be tested or measured. Paracelsus showed no awareness of contradiction. He moved between furnace and stars with equal confidence, applying alchemical reasoning to Mercury one moment and invoking planetary correspondences the next. His self-image reflected this unity. He saw himself not merely as a physician, but as a prophet chosen by God to reveal truths the corrupt establishment had failed to perceive. His later writings took on increasingly apocalyptic tones. He compared himself to Luther, not merely as a reformer, but as a vessel of divine purpose. He declared that his knowledge came not solely from experience but from illumination, a direct communication with the divine source of natural truth. This prophetic self-understanding was central to his medical work, not peripheral. He believed the same God who created the Tria Prima had personally commissioned him to reveal their meaning. For contemporaries, this grandiosity was simultaneously compelling and repellent. Some saw a divinely inspired reformer. Others saw a deluded egomaniac whose mystical pretensions masked fundamental lack of rigor. Both views contained truth, neither captured the whole. He was too original to dismiss and too chaotic to systematize. In the decades following his passing, a movement coalesced around his ideas, fragmented, contentious, but powerful. The most consequential inheritors, however, were those who took his chemical insights and gradually separated them from the mystical framework. The most important was Jan Baptist van Helmont, a Flemish physician born in 1579. Van Helmont rejected the Tria Prima as insufficiently rigorous, but retained Paracelsus's fundamental conviction that bodily processes were chemical. He conducted careful experiments on digestion and fermentation, and introduced the concept of gas, a word he coined, to describe invisible vapors released during chemical reactions. Where Paracelsus had intuited chemical transformation in the body, Van Helmont began to demonstrate it through repeatable observation. Franciscus Sylvius, France de l'Abbaye, a physician at the University of Leiden in the mid-17th century, built on both foundations to develop systematic iatrochemical theory, explaining physiology through acid-base reactions and chemical fermentation. His approach was more structured, more anchored in observable phenomena, and more amenable to institutional teaching. Through Sylvius, chemical medicine found a home in the university, the very institution from which Paracelsus had been expelled. Daniel Senner, working in the early 17th century, attempted to reconcile Paracelsian chemistry with Galenic tradition, seeking a middle path. His work illustrated a broader pattern. Ideas Paracelsus had hurled as revolutionary challenges were gradually absorbed, modified, and integrated into mainstream thought, not as wholesale replacement, but as a powerful complement shifting European medicine decisively toward chemistry. The trajectory from Paracelsus to Van Helmont to Sylvius to modern chemistry was neither straight nor inevitable. It passed through decades of controversy, institutional resistance, and theological suspicion. Paracelsus himself would scarcely have recognized what his followers made of his legacy. He would have found Van Helmont's caution insufficiently bold, Sylvius's systematic approach insufficiently visionary, Sennert's compromises a betrayal. He wanted revolution on his own terms. But history does not operate on any single individual's terms. The ideas he planted took root in soil he could not control and grew in directions he could not have predicted. What mattered was not whether his mysticism was defensible or his personality tolerable. What mattered was the question he had posed. What if the body is not a vessel of humors but a theater of chemical processes? And what if the physician's task is to understand, substance by substance, the chemistry of life itself? That question outlived him. It outlived his enemies. And by the time the 17th century drew toward its close, the answer was becoming clear, not in the mystical terms Paracelsus would have preferred, but in the patient, accumulating language of experiment that his successors brought to bear on the problems he had been the first to name. But before his ideas could pass into other hands, there remained the matter of the man himself, and the long, diminishing arc of the years that followed Basel. After fleeing the city in early 1528, Paracelsus resumed the pattern that had defined his life before his brief moment of institutional visibility. He wandered. He moved through Kalmar, Esslingen, Nuremberg, where he attempted to publish several works and was blocked by the medical faculty, which pressured the city council to deny him printing privileges. He passed through St. Galen, Appenzell, the Tyrol, Moravia, the mining regions of Bohemia. He circled back through Austria and Bavaria, through towns and territories being torn apart by the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, and the rivalries of princes who used religious allegiance as a weapon of statecraft. Nowhere did he stay for long. Nowhere did he find the combination of patronage and tolerance that might have allowed him to consolidate his ideas into a published body of work. The pattern of arrival, promise, conflict, and departure repeated with a regularity suggesting something structural, an incompatibility between the kind of thinker Paracelsus was and the kind of world he inhabited. He demanded total intellectual autonomy. The institutions of his time demanded conformity. The result was perpetual exile. And yet he wrote. Through all the wandering and disappointment, he produced texts at a pace that borders on astonishing. Treatises on surgery, on specific diseases, on the philosophy of medicine, on minerals, on the relationship between stars and body. The manuscripts accumulated, passed to acquaintances and followers, copied and recopied in a widening circle of underground transmission. He published almost nothing during these years. The great treatises remained in manuscript, circulating beneath the surface of official medical culture, waiting for a world that was not yet ready to receive them. His health, meanwhile, was failing. The precise nature of his ailments remains unknown, but the trajectory is unmistakable. He was aging beyond his years, worn by decades of rough living, constant travel, and what some sources suggest was heavy consumption of wine. There has been speculation that prolonged exposure to mercury and other toxic substances contributed to his decline. The irony would have been bitter. The man who understood better than anyone that the dose makes the poison may himself have fallen victim to the cumulative effects of the substances he championed. In 1541, he arrived in Salzburg, invited by Prince Archbishop Ernst of Bavaria. Whether Ernst sought him as a physician, a curiosity, or a figure whose controversial reputation might lend intellectual prestige to his court is not entirely clear. What is clear is that Paracelsus came already diminished, aware that time was short. He drew up a will, a modest document disposing of few possessions, directing that whatever money remained be distributed to the poor. It was the testament of a man who had accumulated almost nothing material in a lifetime of motion. No property, no family, no institutional legacy. Only manuscripts, thousands of pages containing the architecture of a medical revolution the world had not yet recognized. On the 24th of September, 1541, Theophrastus von Hohenheim breathed his last in Salzburg. He was approximately 47 years of age. The circumstances have been debated for centuries. Later legends claimed rival physicians had arranged his destruction. There is no reliable evidence for these stories. They belong to the mythology that formed around him almost immediately, driven by admirers and enemies alike. The most probable explanation is simplest. A body subjected to years of hardship and chemical exposure succumbed to the accumulated toll. He was buried at the Church of Saint Sebastian, where a monument would later be erected, though even the monument became a site of controversy, relocated and redesigned as his reputation rose, fell, and rose again. He left behind a paradox. In life, he had been largely ignored by the establishment, his works unpublished, his ideas known only to a small circle. In the decades after his passing, everything changed. Beginning in the 1550s and accelerating through the following decades, his manuscripts appeared in print, edited and distributed by followers who saw in them the foundations of a new medical order. The timing was significant. By the second half of the 16th century, Europe's intellectual climate had shifted. The Reformation had fractured institutional authority. The Anatomy of Andreas Vesalius, published in 1543, had demonstrated that even Galen could be wrong about the body's structure. Global exploration had introduced diseases and substances the classical texts never imagined. The ground was prepared, and Paracelsus's posthumous publications landed on fertile soil. The result was one of the most intense intellectual controversies in European medical history. By the late 16th century, battle lines were drawn. Galenists defended humoral tradition from their university strongholds. Paracelsians, a diverse, fractious collection of physicians, alchemists, and natural philosophers, insisted the future lay in chemistry. The controversy played out in printed treatises, university disputations, princely courts, and occasionally courts of law. It stretched across more than a century before the synthesis represented by Van Helmont, Sylvius, and their successors began resolving it into something approaching consensus. What emerged was not the wholesale triumph of Paracelsian medicine. The humoral tradition did not vanish overnight. Elements persisted well into the 18th century. But the chemical philosophy Paracelsus had championed, stripped of mystical excess and refined by disciplined experimenters, became increasingly central to European medical thought. The pharmacopoeia expanded to include mineral and metallic preparations alongside traditional botanicals. The concept of specific remedies for specific diseases gained ground. The principle that dose determines whether a substance heals or harms became a foundational axiom, and the attention to occupational and environmental causes of disease laid groundwork for disciplines that would not fully emerge for centuries, but whose origins trace back to the observations of a physician's son, watching men emerge from tunnels with ruined lungs. The question historians have debated ever since, and that resists final resolution, is what to make of the whole. How does one assess a figure simultaneously pioneer and mystic, empiricist and prophet, a man who articulated principles of lasting scientific value and wrapped them in astral influences, divine signatures, and alchemical transmutation? One can celebrate Paracelsus as the father of pharmacology and toxicology, or dismiss him as a grandiose eccentric whose insights were accidental. Neither portrait is adequate. The man who insisted on disease specificity and precise dosage was the same man who believed walnut shells, shaped like the human skull, were divinely intended for head ailments. The physician who described miners' respiratory diseases with pioneering precision was the same one who invoked planetary spirits. These were not separate figures. They were one mind, operating within a framework that had not yet learned to distinguish between claims observation could support and claims only faith could sustain. Perhaps the most honest assessment is also the most uncomfortable. Paracelsus matters not despite his contradictions, but because of them. He stands at a moment when the old synthesis was breaking apart, and the new one had not yet formed, when it was possible to hold empirical observation and mystical conviction in the same intellectual space, because the tools for separating them had not yet been forged. He was not a modern scientist born too early. He was something more interesting, a thinker who belonged fully to his own time, yet produced ideas reaching far beyond it. The fire at Basel still flickers in the historical imagination, a physician feeding the most revered medical textbook to the flames, declaring the old medicine finished. It was an act of destruction, an act of arrogance, but it was also an act of extraordinary conviction, the gesture of a man who believed that the truth of the human body could not be found in ancient pages, but only in the direct encounter between physician, substance, and patient. He did not have a complete system to replace what he burned. He had intuitions, observations, a philosophy still tangled in alchemy and prophecy. But he had asked the essential question, what if everything we think we know about disease is wrong? And once spoken, that question could not be taken back. The ashes scattered. The man who lit the fire wandered on through a dozen more towns and 100 more arguments until his body gave way in Salzburg on an autumn day in 1541. But the question continued to burn, quietly, persistently, through the minds of physicians and chemists who came after, who took what was useful and discarded what was not, who built the foundations of a medicine Paracelsus would not have recognized, but that could not have existed without him.